David Shields is in Vancouver for the DOXA Film Festival. He is the Milliman Distinguished Writer-in-Residence at the University of Washington for good reason. He has written bestsellers, fiction and nonfiction, hundreds of essays and articles, and he has received a Guggenheim Fellowship. One of his books was called The Thing About Life Is That One Day You'll Be Dead. So before that happens, we welcome David Shields to Studio 4 to tell us more. You look alive to me.
Thank you. So do you.
The One Day You'll Be Dead novel?
A work of nonfiction. Okay.
I haven't read it. What prompted it?
Well, what happened? Let's see. I was around. I'm now 55, but this was around 10 years ago. My father was this unbelievably vital 95-year-old person. My daughter was this very, very vital 12-year-old soccer genius. And I felt like this middle-aged drone who had a really bad back. And I wanted to get a revenge on my very vital daughter and my very vital 95-year-old dad. So I wanted to write a book about mortality, about just trying to understand who we are as mortal animals. And so the book is a mix of personal stories about myself and my daughter and my father, how we all relate to our bodies differently. A lot of data about how that we all trace pretty much the same arc from birth to death, how our bodies change. And a lot of really beautiful wisdom from philosophers, from Socrates to Woody Allen about mortality. The book is really a meditation on how to live a life that has some sense and value when you have no belief in any kind of God.
Interesting. Not Christopher Hitchens stuff necessarily.
Not really, but it's not unconnected in the sense the book doesn't deal with atheism arguments. It takes it for granted. And it says, okay, how does one live a life that feels vital when you realize this is the entire ride?
I know you're a man of ideas, and you like ideas, and you like writers who explore ideas.
True. Yeah, I've written a book called Reality Hunger, a manifesto, came out in 2010. And that book is an argument about trying to argue for the obliteration of distinctions between fiction and nonfiction, the overturning of laws regarding appropriation, and the creation of new forms for the 21st century. So that was a very controversial book.
I bet it was. So what you're really saying is a book could be fiction or nonfiction or a little bit of both. It's really a montage.
That's a big word for me. Well, I mean, I'm fond of this wonderful line of David Foster Wallace, who committed suicide a few years ago, and he said that we are existentially alone on the planet. You can't know what I'm thinking and feeling, and I can't know what you're thinking and feeling. And the very best works of art construct a bridge across the abyss of human loneliness. I think that's what art does. And so who could possibly care if a work is called fiction, nonfiction? Why do we have to stay trapped within these very boring, generic conventions? You know, how many more romantic comedies do we need to watch? Do we know how a romantic comedy works? Why do we need yet another generic work of art?
Interesting. So a new kind of genre, if you will.
Or works that don't occupy a generic prison. I'm very fond of this phrase, you know, genre is a minimum security prison. You know, break out. You know, don't, you know, I wrote 3 novels from ages like 25 to 35, and it ended up feeling rather imprisoning to me in the sense that the works I really love, and there's a couple of Canadian writers whose work I love. I love Douglas Copeland's work, who's a Vancouver writer.
Yes.
I love
friend of the show, friend of mine.
I love Brian Foss's work, who was, I think, a former Vancouverite. I think he lives in Toronto now. And I'm very interested in work that basically tries to wrestle with the question of nothing less than how did the writer solve being alive? Not creating a boring narrative that really isn't telling us anything.
Okay.
I really like deeply philosophical and really emotionally naked work.
Who said the best nonfiction gets lucky?
Well, I quote that writer, Antonia Nelson. She's a friend of mine. She's a short story writer. And I think she actually said, it's funny, I got quoted, I wrote a short article for the DOXA catalog.
I read it.
And that's the line of Antonia Nelson. The actual line is, and I think for some reason, I don't know if I typed it up wrong or if the DOXA catalog was a little bit, there's just a typo, but Tony's line is actually, the best fiction gets lucky. And then I wanted to pivot and say, so too the best nonfiction uses its subject as a Trojan horse to explore something larger. Anyway, I'm trying to think of what I'm trying to get to here. The point is that getting lucky has to do with the idea that, for instance, the film I talk about in the DOXA catalog, this wonderful film of Ross McElwee's called Bright Leaves. It looks like it's kind of a pretty standard movie about a guy who travels from Massachusetts to North Carolina to find out how involved his family is or was in the tobacco business. But in fact, the movie is this incredibly beautiful meditation on how all of us find something. Smoking, collecting movie stills, building birdhouses, singing, believing in God, to try to get off planet Earth for a couple seconds every day. And the movie's about how that we'll do anything to feel a little bit of a bright leaf in our life. And the movie is amazingly intelligent and beautiful and funny movie about how every human activity in many ways is an attempt to kind of leave the earth for a few minutes, whether it's, sex, smoking, art, bowling, anything. It's an attempt to
escape from something.
Escape for a second.
And a book helps us escape, as you know, a good book.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of boring books.
This is true.
And they make the bestseller list, and nobody can figure it out.
I know what you mean.
And you think, I bought it because it hit #1 on the New York bestseller list, and it's terrible. So is it just a personal thing, or I haven't read 50 Shades of Grey, but it's apparently a little bit of soft porn, a little bit of this, and a little bit of that, and you think, is it fantastic? I don't know. Somebody said the other day didn't like it at all.
I haven't read 50. This is the sort of sadomasochistic fantasy, I think, about a woman and her very wealthy lover or whatever. I don't know. I haven't read it either, certainly on my bedstand. But the point being, a lot of my art, a lot of the work I do, a lot of the arguments I try to make in books like The Thing About Life is That One Day You'll Be Dead, and Reality Hunger, in my contribution to the DOXA catalog, in my forthcoming book called How Literature Saved My Life, in the Jeff One Lonely Guy project, which I'm the co-author of. I'm trying to say that I wrote 3 novels. They're pretty good, but I wanted to try to create work in which there's a much more naked and much more vulnerable attempt for the writer to connect very deeply with the reader.
Okay, so it lingers with us, because a good book will linger with you.
Exactly, and it's not merely page-turning entertainment, like, okay, a bestseller, a John Grisham novel. I mean, no offense to John Grisham or whoever, but, it's sort of candy for the brain, and even well-respected conventional novels, I find often, are they're essentially narrative machines to keep the reader engaged, and there's an occasionally good moments. But the works I love, works by writers like Simon Gray and Spalding Gray, Maggie Nelson, Sarah Manguso, Amy Fusselman, Leonard Michaels, every single paragraph is trying to get deeper and deeper into the human predicament. There's not a lot of, to me, rather predictable narrative machinery.
Not so much chick lit. Not
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
More like Mrs. Kennedy and Me. Well, who was it who went back to reading nonfiction because he just got tired of a famous author?
Actually, Philip Roth said that. I actually quote that in my forthcoming book. He says, why did I stop reading fiction? He said, I wised up. And again, I'm not sort of creating an anti-novel screed. I've read all the great novels. I've loved them. I've tried to write 3 pretty good novels myself. But I'm part of a movement now of writers in America, Canada, England, across the world, who are really interested in trying to make the essay, the book-length essay, a really exciting form. It's been a great form from St. Augustine through Joan Didion, and we're trying to make it the center of contemporary writing. That we live in a very, obviously, sort of simulated, artificial, mediated culture, highly digitized culture, that we're
a tweet culture, instant information culture, not a lot of substance. The dumbing down of America culture, dumbing down of North America.
Definitely.
Not just because we're of a certain age, I don't think. I think there's a hunger. And that hunger is reflected, I haven't read it yet, but in your book, The Lonely Guy.
Yeah. This is a really interesting project. It's called Jeff, One Lonely Guy. And it was published by Amazon Publishing's new New York City imprint 2 months ago, or let's see, it was published on March 20th, so a month and a half ago. And this is a former student of mine, Jeff Ragsdale, who moved to New York City, was living in Harlem, had a career as a stand-up comedian, an actor. The career was somewhat stalled. He had a very bad breakup with a girlfriend. He was living in Harlem. He was at wit's end, terribly desperate. He posted a flyer on a lamppost in Lower Manhattan and said, if anyone feels like talking, call me, Jeff, One Lonely Guy. He was expecting...
And he put the phone number there.
Put the phone number on. And then he said he was expecting 12 people and 3 dogs to call him. He got 75,000 telephone calls over 6 weeks from all over the world.
And it went viral, right?
Completely viral. If you Google Jeff One Lonely Guy, you get 30 million hits now. And Jeff sent me all the material that he had collected, phone calls that had come in, texts, sex, every possible thing. And a friend and I, Michael Logan and I, working in conjunction with Jeff, took all the material and worked it up into what we think is this really interesting commentary on what it's like to be alive now in a 24/7 porn environment, in an environment in which fame seems to flicker at every internet portal.
At the instant, Justin Bieber's born.
Exactly.
Not that he's not talented, but he's born.
Exactly. And that we live in a very confusing world. I'm not in any way judging it. I just think it's very, very odd to be alive now, in which sort of human feelings are immensely mediated and digitized in ways they weren't when, you know, Sophocles walked the world. And so how do we connect? That obviously things like Facebook connect us, and they obviously hugely disconnect us. And the book explores, it's basically just hundreds of conversations between Jeff and these people who called him or texted him. And we try and gather all this material to try to explore how difficult it is to be alive now, to love now in contemporary
and
Western
to stay
society.
connected now, even though you are connected, certainly globally.
Exactly.
And yet you're not connected, not like they are in a tiny little community in the middle of Africa. Different connection.
Exactly.
Can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thanks, Fanny.
David Shields, distinguished writer. He's working at the University of Washington at the moment, writer in residence, Guggenheim Fellowship, all of that.